The clock had no second hand, only a short needle that trembled, and a longer one that moved in a way that felt hesitant, like it needed permission. Every few minutes someone looked up at it and then looked away, as if the act itself could hurry it along. In the room, the air held its own weight. Not thick, not hot, just present. A lamp buzzed somewhere above, steady enough to be ignored until it wasn't. The buzz was joined by softer sounds. The faint scrape of a chair leg nudged a fraction of an inch, the dry click of a lighter that didn't catch on the first strike, a pencil tapping twice and then stopping as if it remembered it shouldn't be heard. A door at the far end was shut, but not fully. It sat against the frame with a thin line of darkness at the latch, the way a mouth can almost close but still keep a secret. From beyond it came nothing you could name, only the suggestion of movement, a shifting that could have been boots, paper, breath. A muffled voice rose once, too low to carry, and then fell back into the walls. Someone turned a page slowly, letting it drag against the others. The paper wasn't new. It had a stiffness that made it resist the hand. When the page finally gave way, it released a faint dust smell, like old storage, like drawers that hadn't been opened in years. The reader's finger stayed at the margin, holding the place, even though they weren't reading anymore. Another person, standing because sitting had started to feel like choosing a position, adjusted their sleeves and then adjusted them again, not because they were crooked, but because hands needed somewhere to go. Their thumb rubbed a seam until the cloth warmed under it. Their eyes stayed on the shut door, fixed there with an effort that was almost polite. The waiting had a rhythm. Not a clean rhythm, not the kind you can count. It was made of repeated actions that gave the mind something to hold on to. Check the clock, clear the throat, look at the door, look away, smooth the paper, swallow, breathe shallowly so the room didn't have to notice you. A thin metal tray sat on a side table with cups that had been filled long ago. The liquid inside them had cooled into something flat. Steam was a memory. One cup had a ring of dried foam clinging to the rim, as if even warmth had tried to leave a trace and failed. No one drank. No one offered. The cups existed the way furniture exists, silent witnesses to routines that were supposed to happen. In the corner, a wire basket held folded cloths. Beside it, a small waste bin contained a single crushed wrapper and one torn strip of paper, the kind ripped off a pad without thinking. A detail without meaning, except that someone had been here long enough to throw something away. The walls were close enough that the room felt like a pocket, sealed but not secure. Every surface had been wiped clean at some point, but fingerprints returned. They always did. A smudge on the edge of a table, a faint palm mark on the back of a chair. Evidence that waiting made people touch things just to prove they were solid. A man near the window kept lifting the shade a fraction and letting it fall again. Never enough to look outside fully. The motion was small, almost careful, like he was afraid the light might pour in too fast and reveal something everyone had agreed not to see. Each time the fabric slid, it made a soft rasping sound that blended with the lamp's buzz. He did it again, then stopped, as if someone had told him not to. No one had. The room smelled faintly of damp wool and metal. Not unpleasant, just honest. It smelled like things that had been carried, worn, handled, like places where decisions waited on paper for hands to make them real. From somewhere deeper in the building, a bell chimed once, a distant formal sound. It might have been for an elevator or a telephone system or a shift change. The people in the room didn't react at first. Then one of them flinched a second too late, and the delayed movement made it worse, like the body had tried to pretend it didn't care, and failed. A pen cap rolled an inch across the table and stopped against a crease in the wood. Nobody reached for it right away. The stillness around it was strange, as if that tiny motion had asked a question no one wanted to answer. Finally, a hand slid forward and pinned it gently, more like an apology than a correction. The door at the far end remained almost closed. The gap at the latch seemed to widen and narrow with the building's breath. Or maybe it was the lamp flicker. Or maybe the eyes were searching for change because the mind couldn't bear the idea that nothing would change until it did. A small stack of papers lay on the center table, squared perfectly, each page aligned, edges crisp, corners pressed flat. Someone had arranged them carefully, like a ritual. The top sheet was blank from this angle. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was covered in words too small to read without leaning in, without committing to seeing them. No one leaned in. A watch ticked. It wasn't loud, but it found its way into everything. Tick, tick, tick. It made time feel like something mechanical and indifferent, something that didn't care what humans needed. One of the men, older, face drawn tight at the cheeks, shook his head once, barely, like he was clearing a thought that had become dangerous. He pressed his lips together and looked down at his hands. They were steady, but the steadiness looked practiced. On the wall near the door, a thin shadow moved. Not a person, just the trembling of light across something hanging there. The shadow shifted again and then stopped, frozen in place. The room held its breath in response, as if it recognized the language of small signs. Then, at last, a sound reached them that was unmistakable. Footsteps. Not hurried, not running. Just boots moving with purpose down a corridor. Each step landing with the firm certainty of someone who had stopped considering alternatives. The footsteps grew closer, and the people in the room did not speak. They only straightened in subtle ways, as if their spines were being pulled by an invisible thread. The gap in the door remained thin. The footsteps stopped right outside it. And in the quiet that followed, before the latch moved, before anyone entered, before anything could be said, the room understood something without words. Whatever chance existed was measured in seconds now. The door didn't open right away. There was a pause, the kind that wasn't hesitation, but procedure. A hand on the other side tested the handle as if confirming it was real. Metal shifted against metal. Then the latch gave with a soft click that sounded too small for what it carried. A man stepped in without looking at anyone first. He carried nothing in his hands, yet his posture suggested weight. His coat was damp at the shoulders as if he'd come through mist or light rain, and when he moved it released a cold smell from outside. Wet stone, exhaust, the faint sour tang of smoke that clung to the city even when the city slept. Behind him, the corridor stayed dim and empty. He pulled the door nearly shut again, leaving the same narrow gap at the latch, the same thin line of darkness, as if the room still wasn't allowed to seal itself. "Still here," someone said, not as a greeting, more like an observation. The man nodded once and crossed to the table. His boots made no dramatic sound, but the floorboards answered him anyway, a quiet complaint under each step. He placed his palm flat on the top page of the stack, not to move it yet, just to claim it, to mark the moment as official. Outside the window, the day looked unfinished. The light was gray and low, pressed down by cloud cover that seemed heavy enough to touch. Somewhere beyond the glass, engines idled and then stopped. A truck door slammed. The sound arrived late, filtered through distance and thick walls, like reality struggling to reach them. Someone poured fresh coffee without being asked. The liquid hit the cup with a dull, impatient patter, then settled. The steam rose briefly and then thinned, disappearing into the room as if it didn't belong here either. The person who poured it didn't drink. They set the cup down beside the papers, close enough to be useful, far enough not to stain anything. The man who had entered slid a sheet from the stack, slow and exact. When the paper moved, the room's attention moved with it. Eyes tracked the motion like birds tracking a small shift in wind. He didn't read aloud yet. He only scanned, eyes narrowing slightly at certain lines, mouth tightening and then relaxing again. It wasn't the face of shock. It was the face of confirmation. Across the table, another officer, rank indistinct, authority implied more by stillness than insignia, rested 2 fingers against his own wrist, as if counting a pulse that didn't need counting. His gaze stayed on the paper, but he didn't lean forward. He didn't want to appear eager. The room had learned how to act normal while waiting for the world to stop pretending. A telephone sat on a side desk, heavy and black, its cord coiled like something asleep. No one touched it. They all knew it could wake at any time. They all knew what voice might come through it, and what tone that voice would choose. Calm, professional, almost bored, because urgency was a luxury reserved for people who didn't understand the stakes. A clerk moved in the background, reorganizing objects that had no need for reorganization. A stapler nudged closer to a folder aligned with the table edge, a pencil placed precisely parallel to a ruler. The movements were quiet, polite, and relentless, like prayers. From the corridor, distant footsteps passed and faded, the building continuing its own routines, people going places, carrying messages, shifting responsibility from one room to another. Somewhere a radiator clicked. Somewhere a typewriter started and stopped again, as if the typist couldn't decide whether to commit words to paper. The man at the table finally spoke, but his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "They're behind," he said. No one asked who. Nobody asked behind what. The sentence landed with the comfort of something expected and the irritation of something dangerous. "How far?" someone murmured. The man gave a small shrug that wasn't casual. It was controlled uncertainty, a calibrated answer. "Enough to matter," he said. A few breaths shifted in the room. Not a sigh. Not relief. Just the body adjusting to new information the way a ship adjusts to a subtle change in current. Another man, younger, with eyes too awake for the hour, let out a short laugh that stopped immediately after it began, like a reflex that embarrassed itself. He cleared his throat. "They always run behind," he said, trying to place the problem inside a familiar box. "It's nothing." His tone carried optimism the way a thin coat carries warmth. Not enough, but better than skin. A few heads nodded, not because they believed him fully, but because believing felt like doing something. The older officer didn't nod. He stared at the blank edge of the paper as if the truth lived there, hiding. "Nothing," he repeated softly. The word didn't sound reassuring. It sounded like a dare. The window rattled once, a faint vibration, like distant machinery or a gust pressing against the frame. The curtain moved a fraction. The room went still, as if it had been corrected. On the table, a map lay folded under a clear sheet, corners held down by metal weights. It had been unfolded and refolded so many times that creases had become permanent scars. The map wasn't decorative. It was a living object, worn by hands that wanted certainty from lines and symbols. Someone touched the edge of it now, not unfolding it yet, only resting fingertips where borders met, where decisions turned into terrain. A voice from the back of the room broke the quiet. "The weather's holding," the clerk said, reading from a small slip of paper. He didn't look up when he spoke, as if making eye contact would make the statement less true. "Low ceiling. Visibility. Moderate. Good." Someone answered too quickly. "Good." A word said with the same fragile confidence as nothing. The man who had arrived held the sheet above the table, hovering as if the air itself could delay what was written. He glanced toward the nearly shut door, the thin gap still there, still breathing. Then his eyes returned to the room. "They're asking for a confirmation," he said. No one moved. It was as if the sentence had turned the air into glass. A confirmation, a clean, administrative phrase. It didn't describe what would follow. It didn't need to. It only described the moment before it, the moment where the world still pretended there were options. The younger man leaned forward at last, forearms on the table, trying to look involved instead of anxious. "Why now?" he asked, almost whispering, as if asking the question loudly might summon an answer he didn't want. "Because they can't wait any longer," the messenger said, and then after a beat, added in a lower voice, "or they don't want to." That second sentence sat like a cold coin on the tongue. A faint sound came from the telephone. Nothing as clear as a ring, just a tiny electrical pop, like the line waking up. Everyone noticed. No one acknowledged it. Their eyes stayed where they had already chosen to place them, because moving their gaze felt like surrendering control. Across the room, someone checked their watch and then checked it again, as if time might have shifted during the glance. The older officer finally spoke, voice flat. "We're still within the window," he said. It wasn't reassurance. It was a calculation, spoken aloud so it could be shared, so responsibility could be spread thin enough not to tear. The clerk swallowed audibly. The sound was small and human and out of place. Outside, the gray light remained steady. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly and then cut off, like someone had remembered they weren't supposed to draw attention. In the room, the coffee cup sat untouched, steam gone, surface dark and still. The messenger set the paper down at the exact center of the table, aligning its edges with the stack beneath it. The precision felt ceremonial. Then he slid a pen forward, not dramatic, not forceful, just a quiet offering. The pen stopped an inch from the older officer's hand. No one spoke. No one reached. In that silence, routines held their breath. The building listened. Even the lamp's buzz seemed to lower itself, as if it understood the rules. The older officer stared at the pen, his fingers resting beside it, close enough to touch without moving. And somewhere, unseen beyond the walls, time kept advancing, patient, indifferent, closing the distance to the moment when the last chance would no longer exist. The map was unfolded at last. Not all at once. One corner first, then another, the paper resisting with a soft crackle, like it resented being exposed again. Creases ran across it in intersecting lines, old folds layered over newer ones, the surface marked by use rather than age. The metal weights were shifted carefully, never lifted entirely, just nudged aside and replaced, as if even gravity had to be managed gently. Someone traced a route with the blunt end of a pencil, stopping short of the point everyone expected. The pause was deliberate. The pencil hovered, tip trembling just slightly, then withdrew. "Still clear," the man said, though he hadn't checked anything new. Clear. Another word that did more work than it deserved. The telephone clicked again, barely audible, the kind of sound that could be dismissed as a loose wire or a building settling. A few heads turned this time, just a fraction, eyes flicking toward the desk, and then away. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. The line stayed silent. A runner appeared briefly in the doorway, younger than the others, face flushed from moving too quickly through corridors where speed was discouraged. He held a folded message between two fingers like it might stain him if he gripped it too tightly. "Message from operations," he said. No urgency, no drama, just delivery. The older officer nodded, and the runner crossed the room, boots tapping in a rhythm that didn't match the quiet. He placed the message on the table, directly on top of the map, covering a stretch of terrain that suddenly felt vulnerable. The runner didn't wait for acknowledgement. He turned and left, the door returning to its almost closed position behind him, the thin gap restored like a ritual. The message was opened. It contained fewer words than expected. Someone read it aloud, voice steady, pronouncing each phrase carefully, as if clarity alone could neutralize meaning. The words described a minor adjustment, a recalculation, a delay that was framed as insignificant, procedural, temporary, well within tolerance. "Nothing new," the younger man said, relieved to have something to say again. The older officer didn't respond. He studied the message as if it were written in another language, one that required more than translation. He turned it over, as though the reverse might hold something different. It didn't. Across the room, the clerk adjusted his glasses and made a small note on a pad that already held several similar notes. Dates, times, figures that looked orderly until you noticed how often they'd been crossed out and rewritten. Outside, the light shifted almost imperceptibly. Not darker, just flatter, the kind of change you only notice because you've been staring too long. A voice drifted in from the corridor. Two men talking, casual, almost cheerful. One laughed. The sound slid under the door and into the room like a foreign object. It didn't belong there. It faded quickly as the voices moved on, but the echo lingered, awkward and exposed. "Lunch will be late," someone said, reading from a schedule pinned to the wall. A few smiles appeared, thin and automatic. Delays were familiar. Delays were survivable. Delays implied continuity. The man by the window lifted the shade again, this time just enough to see a strip of sky. Gray, unbroken, low. He let the fabric fall back into place. "They'll make up the time," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "They always do," another voice answered, almost reflexively. The map drew attention again. The older officer leaned forward now, forearms on the table, his presence changing the geometry of the room. He studied a particular junction, a place where lines converged and then disappeared beneath the fold. He pressed the paper flat with his palm, smoothing it as if touch could make it honest. "There's margin here," he said quietly. It wasn't a declaration. It was a hypothesis. No one challenged it. No one confirmed it either. The idea of margin, of space, of forgiveness, hung in the air, abstract and comforting. A faint tremor ran through the building. Not an impact, just vibration, distant and low, like machinery engaging somewhere far below. The cups on the tray rattled softly, ceramic against metal. The sound stopped almost as soon as it began. "Maintenance," someone offered. Of course. Maintenance explained everything. The telephone rang once. Not a full ring. Just a sharp, incomplete sound, like the line had been tested and then thought better of it. Every head turned this time. Every movement froze. The silence that followed was thick enough to press against the ears. No second ring came. The clerk exhaled slowly, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced at the phone, then at the older officer, waiting for instruction that didn't arrive. "It's fine," the younger man said, too quickly again. "False signal." The older officer's eyes stayed on the telephone. His expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted, subtle as a fault line under pressure. "Make a note," he said to the clerk. The clerk hesitated. Of the time," the officer replied. The clerk wrote it down. Minutes passed, or seconds stretched. It was hard to tell. Another message arrived. This one delivered by voice over the corridor line, crackling, distant, words slightly distorted by interference. The speaker sounded tired, irritated by the need to repeat information that should have been obvious. "Yes, we're aware," the older officer said into the receiver. "No, that won't be necessary." "Understood." He hung up without ceremony. "They're adjusting again," he said to the room. The younger man frowned. "That's the third time." "Fourth," the clerk corrected quietly, without looking up. A pause followed. Not long, just long enough to acknowledge the correction and then bury it. "They're still confident," the younger man added, as if confidence were contagious. The older officer nodded once. "They always are." A chair scraped softly as someone shifted their weight. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. On the map, the pencil returned, this time tracing farther along the route past the point of comfort. The pencil stopped again. The hand holding it tightened, then loosened. No one spoke. The telephone remained silent. Outside, something moved across the gray sky. Too distant to identify, too slow to provoke alarm. The man by the window watched it disappear and then turned away, choosing not to describe it. The pen still lay on the table, exactly where it had been left, untouched. Dust settled around it in invisible increments. The older officer glanced at his watch. Then he did something small that went unnoticed by most of the room. He adjusted the watch's strap, tightening it by a single notch. It was an insignificant action, routine, practical, but it marked a moment, because from then on, the time he carried would no longer allow for mistakes. The corridor clock struck the quarter hour with a sound that felt louder than it should have been. Not a chime, just a blunt mechanical knock, metal against metal, announcing time as a fact rather than a suggestion. The sound bled through the walls and settled into the room, where it stayed longer than the echo deserved. The older officer looked up immediately, not surprised, expectant. "That's it," he said, though no one had asked what. A chair scraped back as someone stood. Another followed. The room shifted from waiting to readiness without ever acknowledging the transition. Jackets were straightened, sleeves smoothed, a button fastened that had been left open all morning as if comfort still mattered. The map was folded again, but not completely, only enough to expose a specific section, the part that now seemed to pull the eye whether one wanted it to or not. The metal weights were placed with more care than before, as if precision itself might delay consequence. A voice crackled from the wall speaker. Operations again. The connection was poor, syllables stretched thin by distance and interference. The speaker repeated himself once, then again, irritation creeping in around the edges. "Yes," the older officer replied. "I understand." He paused, listening. "Yes, that's correct." Another pause. Longer this time. "Stand by," he said at last and replaced the receiver. No one asked what had been said. The room had learned that questions could be more dangerous than silence. The younger man shifted from foot to foot, the optimism he'd been wearing all morning beginning to fray. He rubbed his palms together once and then stopped, realizing the sound carried. "If they move now," he said carefully, testing the idea aloud, "we still have room." room, margin, window. The vocabulary of delay returned, reshaped and reused, comforting because it was familiar. The older officer didn't dismiss the thought. That was worse than arguing. He walked to the window and lifted the shade fully this time. Light flooded in. Not bright, not revealing, but enough to erase the last illusions of shelter. Outside, vehicles idled in uneven lines. Men stood in small clusters, talking, smoking, waiting for instructions that hadn't arrived yet. No one looked rushed. No one looked alarmed. Normality, performing its role perfectly. "They're already committed," the older officer said, not unkindly. The younger man frowned. "Committed isn't the same as final," the officer finished for him. The word landed softly, without force. That was what made it dangerous. At the table, the clerk gathered his notes into a neat stack, then separated them again, as if unsure which version of order applied now. His pencil hovered above the paper, waiting for a reason to move. A knock came at the door. Not the casual knock of interruption. A precise one. 2 sharp taps, evenly spaced. The room froze. "Come in," the older officer said. The door opened fully this time. A change that felt irreversible, though no one could have said why. The messenger wore a different uniform than the others, his insignia unfamiliar to some in the room. He carried a sealed envelope, thick and official, the kind designed to look reassuring. His face was blank, trained to deliver information without absorbing it. "From command," he said, stepping forward. He placed the envelope on the table and waited. The older officer broke the seal slowly. Inside were multiple pages clipped together, their edges crisp. He scanned them quickly, faster than before, as if searching for something specific. "Anything?" the younger man asked. The officer didn't answer right away. He reached the final page, then returned to the first, checking a detail he hadn't wanted to believe. "Yes," he said finally, and "no." That answer satisfied no one, but it ended the question. He passed the packet across the table. Hands reached for it, then withdrew, unsure of their place. Finally, the younger man took it and began to read, his eyes moving faster with each line. "They're asking us to acknowledge," he said. "Acknowledge what?" someone asked. "That conditions have shifted," the younger man replied. "Slightly." The word slightly did too much work. The older officer watched him carefully. And that further adjustments may not be possible. The room absorbed this quietly. No raised voices, no protests. Just the slow realization that the language had changed, subtly but decisively. Outside, an engine revved and then cut. Another took its place. Movement increased, not frantic, but purposeful, like pieces aligning on a board. The telephone rang again. This time, it completed the sound. No one flinched. The older officer crossed the room and lifted the receiver. "Yes." He listened. His expression remained controlled, but his eyes darkened slightly like a sky before rain. "Yes, I see." A pause. "Yes, understood." He replaced the receiver gently. "They're ready," he said. Ready, not waiting, not preparing. Ready. The younger man swallowed. "We can still—" The older officer raised a hand, not to silence him, but to slow the moment. "We can still respond," he said. "We can still signal. We can still raise concerns. But," the younger man pressed. "But once we do," the officer continued, "we own what follows." The room grew still. Ownership, responsibility, words that rarely appeared until they could no longer be avoided. The clerk cleared his throat. "If we delay," he said quietly, "it won't stop it. It will only change where it happens." No one contradicted him. The map seemed to watch them. The pen remained on the table, unmoved. But now it felt closer, as if the distance between it and the officer's hand had narrowed without anyone touching it. Outside, the sky pressed lower. The light flattened further, erasing contrast, making edges blur. A bird crossed the window briefly and vanished. The younger man looked around the room, at the familiar faces, at the walls that had contained so many ordinary days. "This is still the window," he said, not entirely convinced. The older officer looked at his watch again, not to check the time, to confirm it. "We're inside it," he said. "Barely." The room held its breath, because windows close quietly, and no one ever hears the exact moment they do. The pen moved, not by much. Just enough to roll a fraction of an inch, nudged by a hand that hadn't meant to touch it. The sound it made, metal against wood, was so soft it almost vanished. Almost. Every eye found it anyway. No one commented. No one acknowledged that the distance between intention and action had just narrowed. The pen came to rest, pointing inward, toward the center of the table, as if it had chosen a direction on its own. The older officer placed his hand flat beside it. Not on it. Beside it. The gesture felt deliberate, measured, like drawing a line without marking it. Outside, the engines no longer idled unevenly. Their sound had synchronized, a low, steady presence that pressed against the building from all sides. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was constant. A voice came through the wall speaker again, clearer this time. Too clear. "Confirm receipt," the voice said. The phrasing was neutral, procedural. It assumed the answer. The clerk glanced instinctively at the clock, then caught himself and looked away, as if time might react to being watched. He picked up his pencil, set it down, then picked it up again, unable to decide whether recording this moment would make it real. The younger man leaned closer to the table, lowering his voice even though no one else was speaking. "If we respond now," he said, "we're still responding." The older officer didn't look at him. His gaze stayed fixed on the pen, the paper, the small geography of the table. "And if we don't," the younger man continued more carefully, "we're deciding without saying so." Silence answered him. The room had crossed into a different kind of quiet now. Not the stretched calm of waiting, but the compressed stillness of a decision already forming, invisible but heavy. The telephone line hummed faintly, alive and patient. The older officer exhaled slowly through his nose. It was the first visible sign of fatigue all morning. Not doubt. Fatigue. The kind that comes when every option carries weight. He reached for the pen. This time no one looked away. He didn't pick it up immediately. His fingers wrapped around it, resting there, feeling its balance, its coolness. A tool designed to make things official, permanent. "Once this is acknowledged," he said quietly, "there's no pause after." No one argued. Outside, a door slammed somewhere in the yard. A shout followed, indistinct, routine. The sound of coordination rather than alarm. Footsteps moved with purpose now, not waiting for instruction but following it. The younger man swallowed again. "Command will interpret silence as assent," he said. "Yes," the older officer replied. "And acknowledgement as consent," the younger man added. "Yes." The clerk's pencil snapped, not loudly, just the sharp final sound of wood giving way under pressure it could no longer absorb. The clerk stared at the broken tip in his hand as if it had betrayed him, then carefully set the pencil down in two pieces, aligning them neatly. No one commented. The older officer lifted the pen. It felt heavier now, though nothing about it had changed. He signed. Not with flourish, not with hesitation. Just a name, written the way it had been written 1,000 times before. Efficient. Controlled. Legible. The act took less than a second. When the pen left the paper, the room did not change immediately. The walls did not shake. No alarm sounded. The engines outside did not grow louder. That was the cruelest part. The older officer set the pen down exactly where it had been before. "Send it," he said. The clerk gathered the papers with hands that remained steady, though his breathing had changed. He moved to the desk, fed the pages into the transmitter, and flipped the switch. A soft mechanical whir filled the room, brief and unimpressive. A light blinked once, then went steady. Transmission complete. The clerk didn't announce it. He didn't need to. Outside, the engines rose together now, no longer idling, no longer waiting for permission. The sound spread outward, not aggressive, just committed. The younger man closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted behind them. Not panic, not fear. Acceptance. The older officer checked his watch one last time. Then he did something small, almost polite. He loosened the strap, just a notch. Because from this point forward, time no longer belonged to him, and the line they had crossed would never be visible, only felt, in everything that followed. The engines settled into a steadier rhythm. Not louder, just resolved. The sound no longer searched for balance or timing. It held, constant and even, like breath taken after a decision has already been made. Inside the room, no one spoke about it. The noise existed now the way weather exists. Present, unavoidable, no longer discussed. The clerk remained by the transmitter, hand resting near the switch long after it had gone quiet, as if waiting for the machine to object. It didn't. The small light stayed steady, indifferent, a single point of calm in a room that had run out of it. Outside the window, movement slowed in an unnatural way. Vehicles that had been repositioning stopped. Men finished their cigarettes and ground them out carefully, taking time to make sure the embers were dead. Helmets were adjusted, gloves pulled on and then pulled tighter, fingers flexing once, twice, to test familiarity. Preparation had ended. Habit had taken over. Inside, chairs remained where they were. No one sat. Sitting felt wrong now, like pretending the body still had a choice. Jackets stayed buttoned. Papers stayed stacked. The map was left partially open, the route still visible, no longer theoretical. The older officer stood at the window without lifting the shade again. He didn't need to see. The image was complete enough in his mind. Behind him, the younger man stared at the table, at the place where the pen had rested, at the faint indentation the paper still held from the pressure of the signature. His hands were empty, and he kept them that way. The telephone rang. Once, then stopped. No one reached for it. They all understood the courtesy being extended. There would be no more calls unless something went wrong, and wrong was no longer a condition that could be corrected from this room. The building itself seemed to sense the shift. The low hum of power steadied. The occasional clicks and pops faded. Even the lamp above stopped flickering, its light fixed and reliable, illuminating faces that no longer searched for reassurance. Outside, the sky pressed down harder, the cloud ceiling lowering by degrees too small to measure but impossible to ignore. Light lost its depth. Shadows flattened. The world prepared itself for an event it had not been told about. The clerk stepped back from the desk and folded his hands behind his back. A formal posture. A closing one. Time, he said quietly, reading it from the clock without looking away from it. No one asked him to repeat it. The older officer nodded once, acknowledging not the number but the meaning. A distant horn sounded. Short, controlled. Not a warning, a signal of alignment. It echoed faintly and then disappeared, swallowed by the air. Inside the room, breath became noticeable again. Not rushed, just present. Each inhale felt deliberate. Each exhale sounded louder than it should have. The younger man glanced at the door, the one that had remained almost closed all day. He expected it to open, for someone to come running in with new information, a correction, a reason to stop. It stayed still. The thin gap at the latch no longer seemed to breathe. Outside, something shifted that could not be seen from this angle. A movement felt rather than observed. The engines responded, adjusting their tone by a fraction, settling into final position. The older officer closed his eyes. Not in regret, not in fear, in recognition. When he opened them again, he did not look at the others. He did not need to. Whatever needed to be shared had already been. The clock on the wall ticked. Once, then again. The sound felt sharper now, each beat cutting cleanly through the quiet. In the space between those ticks, between what had already been set in motion and what had not yet arrived, the room held its breath, and time paused at the edge of impact.